Murdoch was a brilliant writer. Her early life was one of great idealism and political activism as a member of the Communist Party in 1930s Oxford. Well, now, a new collection of letters and diaries, edited by her biographer, Peter Conradi, gives new insight into what she thought of her contemporaries, many of whom went on to great things politically. James Naughtie has spoken to one of the few still living, the former Labour Chancellor, Denis Healey.
I've come to talk about Iris Murdoch deep in the Sussex countryside, to one of her old friends from Oxford student days, about her spirit and verve and the turbulent politics they shared as pre-war student communists, in an era that was, for both of them, maybe the most intense they would ever know. I'm with Peter Conradi, Iris Murdoch's biographer, and editors of her wartime letters and journals, and we're going to sit down with Denis Healey.
I think the basic point about Iris in those days was that she was very tough-minded, tough in every sense really, and very, very active politically as well as in the literary world. And we all liked her very much indeed. I was a great friend of hers for the whole of her life, although we were never had a sexual relationship of any sort, but I liked her very, very much. We were both in the Communist Party together, but of course in those days the Communist Party was slightly to the right of the Liberal Party.
Peter Conradi, coming in at this point, what's the question that you want to ask after that?
In what way was it to the right of the Liberal Party?
The basic thing was that the Russians were very, very anxious to establish good relations with the West, because they foresaw a war with Hitler in which they would want to have the West as allies.
Peter Conradi, it is extraordinary to hear these reflections from an era which, for most people now, has slipped into history. And it's important to remember how different it was, the kinds of different judgments that people were making. What were Iris Murdoch's politics at that time? How did they evolve, do you think?
Well, she was, the first thing she did when she came up to Oxford was join the party. Yeah. I think at her school in Babington, she'd been trained to think that Stalin was a sort of benevolent grandmother figure, which was not the case. You've written about this in your autobiography. You said that any undergraduate who wanted to stop Hitler was ripe for the Communist Party because the other parties were not playing along.
That's right. I mean, the trouble at that time was that the Labour Party was half pacifist. Exactly. Lansbury had an enormous influence on it, and therefore were not really prepared to stand up to Hitler, and the Communist Party was the only one which was unequivocally anti-Hitler.
Exactly. Yeah.
For those of us of a later generation, looking back to those times with a very emotional atmosphere in politics, it's extraordinary to remember how many people were active in the various political societies of that era in Oxford, who subsequently rose to the top in politics.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Typical of the situation was that Sandy Lindsay, the Master of Balliol, stood as the Popular Front candidate with support from me as a communist and Ted Heath as a Conservative.
Iris was treasurer of the old Oxford University Labour Party. Roy Jenkins was treasurer of the new Dem Soc.
That's right.
And as the British Army prepared to evacuate across from Dunkirk, Roy would write to Iris, "Dear Miss Murdoch," trying to sort out the relative assets. And every letter from her began, "Dear Comrade Jenkins."
Yes, I know. That was very much the case with Iris. Yeah. And I still have a very clear picture in my mind of Iris walking below the platform to speak for the Communist Party, of which I was then the chairman and also a communist. But you could be a member of the Communist Party and the Labour Party at the same time in those days.
And then came the very painful split. There was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalin and Hitler were together. And the whole thing, for idealists of the 30s, began to split apart.
That's right.
You signed up. You were off to the army. Now, what was it like at that period as some people stayed with the communists and others, like you, went?
I was always a little surprised that people stayed in the CP, although some of them who stayed I knew well and quite liked. But the Stalin-Hitler Pact really destroyed communism in Britain forever, and of course it's never existed significantly since. The striking thing, though, about Iris's writing is that communism seemed to have no influence on it whatever. And if you read her poetry, and she wrote a lot of good poetry in those years, there is no reference whatever to politics of any sort in it. It's all about human beings and love and things like that. This is a poem which Iris wrote about her headmistress at badminton school in Bristol, which she attended. Your genius was a monumental confidence to which even the word courage seems untrue. In your Art Deco pastoral ambience, you sat knowing what to do. Pure idealism was what you had to give, like no one now tells people how to live. With your thin silver hair and velvet hand and colourless enthusiastic eyes, you waved the passport to a purer land, a sort of universal ancient Greece, under whose cool and scrutinizing sun beauty and truth and good were obviously one.
Just one last thought to both of you. Peter, first of all, when you look back to that period as someone who's looking through these letters and journals, biographer of Iris Murdoch, how does this period seem to you, in essence? What would you say about it? And I'll ask the same question of Denis Healey in a moment.
Wow. I mean, the style of the period is resolutely undramatic, but underneath there is this terrific passion that fascism has to be uprooted, and at whatever cost. It is an extraordinary period. In some way, it's still with us. We live in its aftermath.
That's probably it, isn't it? It's passion.
Yes, very much so. The great thing was everything had meaning and still has meaning. And I don't feel that's always the case with people who haven't had that experience.
Denis Healey, Peter Conradi, thank you both very much.